after the first one, so I do expect to have after this one I had like
Well, Shannon. We'll be better next. And welcome everybody. A great week for the research series and happy Ash Wednesday. I saw by the sample gates, there's a preacher out there and there's a sign that says, get your ashes over here. That was fantastic. So there's a couple of events coming up. It looks like, I'm not even sure what this In the Kitchen with Kashika is. That looks cool. Is there something about food? That I'm right in the middle. How about afterward? Speaking of food, it sounds really cool. I just wanted to give you a chance to, after you swallow. But hey, and next Monday we have the colloque with Aaron. There's a lot, which is going to be really cool too, on climate adaptive institutions and urban water management. But today, blood is thicker than water, and we have a proper intro from Andrew right here. Take us away, sir. And you're done chewing first. Did you want to say anything?
So I mean, Kashika, she's out of SGIS in Telugu School. She does a lot of work with students in South Asian cuisine.
Oh, cool.
She does cooking with Kashika, and so down at the Food Institute,
That's amazing.
every other week or so.
Okay.
Please join with that.
Oh,
She's
that's great.
works with a lot of grad students.
4 to 6 on Friday. That'd be awesome. Okay. Very cool. Very cool.
Please join up. I tend to love it, and I love it when she's cooking there because she's very hospitable.
That's fantastic. That's what we like.
Where is it?
A little healthier than our fare as well.
It's out here on Park Avenue.
That's right. Yeah, right down the road. That's right. Just a few buildings. Okay, Andrew, over to you, sir.
So I'm happy to introduce Shannon Conley. So Shannon is a 5th year PhD student at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. She's currently an Ostrom Fellow and a recipient of the Roy Shin Fellowship Award. So take it away, Shannon. Looking forward to it.
You read the paper. I'm presenting this a little different today, so just bear with me. We're going to go through why I think it's important first. So I'm presenting Blood is Thicker Than Water, the Role of Identity on Trust and Regulatory Acceptance. In this paper, I'm trying to figure out if identity has an impact on the relationship between trust and compliance in the enforcement process.
What do we got? Maybe right there. Maybe try one more time. There we go. Okay.
Cool. Okay, so a brief overview of fisheries. In the last 40 years, we've had a moderate increase on overexploitation in the entire world. In the context of the US fish stocks in the last couple of years, we've seen a very, very slight decline, which is interesting and surprising because the US fishing system has been considered one of the more successful fishery programs. In contrast to that, we have seen a pretty sustained interest in the capture of fish, as well as a pretty dramatic rise in actual interest in consumption. But this is a dissertation chapter, so let's zoom in. I can't do the whole world. So in the United States, we have a small but pretty influential fishing industry. It creates 1.7 million jobs, almost 250 billion in sales, and 117 billion in value added post that. We had a decrease in the number of financial benefits of fisheries, as well as the actual landings, which is basically how many fish and how big they're being brought. Despite that, it's still a pretty prolific industry, but again, dissertation, so let's zoom in even further and focus on Florida. So why does this matter in Florida? So in Florida, we've had a pretty dramatic and newsworthy last 20 years in fisheries. The Northern Florida Appalachian oyster, which is a pretty historic system, has been shut down. Red tide has been pretty prolific. Fishermen have attempted to push for changes in DC. Stone crab landings have hit bottom. There have been tighter restrictions, and despite this, in the survey I ran, only 18% of the fishermen said that they would ever change jobs. So this is the kind of full project I'm looking at here. So my dissertation is the intergroup relationships and resource extraction, enforcement, and governance, focusing on government agencies and commercial fishing, which is a very long way to say I'm looking at how governments and fishing industries interact and the different outcomes we get from that. So I'm doing it in 3 papers, which is the one I'm presenting today. The workers' identity and culture during threats from industry decay and competition, then the unintended societal consequences of environmental regulatory changes. So we're focusing on the first one today. And so I'd like to start this section with a quote from Eleanor Ostrom in the Escatet Foundation interview, which is, "Trust is the most important resource. If a community has been forbidden from managing its resource for a long time, the main obstacle to overcome is the lack of trust in the effort to get organized in the first place. It is not a trivial matter." So going off that, I asked the question, can trust be impacted or manipulated by the intrinsic characteristics of individuals within a resource system? So a little bit of background of trust within government regulations. So what is trust? I'm defining trust as the level of confidence individuals have in a public institution work in the best interest of the constituents. And then it facilitates the consent to governmental decisions and ensures cooperation between constituents and governments. It matters because, again, it encourages participation, increases satisfaction with the government, and also ensures that individuals are less likely to shirk government rules and laws. So when we talk about trust and regulations, that last component is really important. Specifically, when we look at regulations where there needs to be some kind of collaborative element with the regulators and the regulatees, in spaces where like common pool systems, ensuring that trust is present and maintained is very, very important to ensuring that system is functioning properly. We talk about identity in public management, which is my field. So identity has been an increasingly important component of public management research. We have seen it mainly in the context of race, gender, and education or socioeconomic class. And it's been examined in 2 main ways. We have represented bureaucracy, which basically states that the more your bureaucracy looks like its constituents, the more similar their values will be, and you get more equitable outcomes. This hinges on the idea that shared identity indicates shared values, which I think is beginning to change. And as we start to look at things more intersectionally, obviously that assumption is getting pretty hard pressed. The newer way to look at it is the social identity theory, which basically argues that we have these in-groups and out-groups, and an in-group identity will be impacted by the salience of that at the time. And so that in-group, out-group behavior is basically hinged on whatever identity is salient. But both of these have a really limited view of identity. They've only been examined with, like I said, race, education, gender. We have more recent ones starting to examine like sexuality. But there's still some limitations. I argue that in the context of regulation, a really important aspect of identity is occupational identity, which is the linkages between one's core understanding of self and their occupational choices. This is very popular in business management. However, it hasn't necessarily been brought over to public administration as much. From business management, I take these 2 concepts of occupational identity, which is social occupational identity, personal occupational identity. So social occupational identity or group identity is the culture or collective identity within occupations. And it's the process of social comparison, categorization, and group identification. It's generally the idea that group identities within an occupation can shape your decision-making. And then personal occupational identity, or I refer to as individual identity, is a process of social comparison and categorization and group identification. It exhibits more like this idea of the social identity theory that we see. And similar, it can, oh, sorry, that was the same one. Sorry. Personal occupational identity is the idea that your own individual conceptualization of self is impacted by your identification with a group, and you're therefore going to exhibit in-group and out-group behavior. Separate of the group itself, though. Really intertwined definitions. We'll go to show that they actually do have some separate impacts and conceptualizations when we start asking the questions, but those are the two ways we think about it. So, breaking it down, this is what my theory is. We start with the basic idea that trust impacts willingness to engage with their regulation, which impacts the health of an ecosystem. Pretty straightforward, nothing new here, which produces my first hypothesis that an increase in government trust will be associated with an increase in commitment to regulatory engagement. Nothing crazy. This is where things get a little wonky. I start bringing this idea of occupational identity. So the first way I'm thinking of it is an increased strength in social occupational identity will have a negative impact on trust, or an increased strength in personal occupational identity will have a negative impact on trust. So it's this idea that occupational identity impacts trust, which then impacts the rest of the system. Or it could just be a situation where it has a mitigating effect. So an increased strength in social occupational identity will have a moderating impact on the relationship between trust and compliance. And the same will be experienced for a personal occupational identity. Negative moderating, to clarify. So where am I testing this? As we talked about earlier, I'm looking at fisheries. In Florida specifically, they're super economically important. They are subject to really complex challenges because of climate change, as we spoke earlier, decreased stock, increase red tide, as well as greater competition economically from outside sources. Despite this, as I noted, we see the strong dedication to the field and also a noted resentment towards regulators. And then in the system of the Gulf Coast of Florida and the Atlantic coast of Florida, there's large variations in habitats, regulations, and practices. So we get some of the variations in that as well. So I administered a survey to commercial fisher people in the state of Florida. There is 3,769. And thankfully, Florida is the Sunshine State, and which means all of their legal documents and government documents have to be public. So if you apply for a commercial fishing license, I get your number and your email. And that's how I got that source. I administered the survey for approximately a month in October. Survey's 50-minute runtime on average. Obviously, there's some variations with that. And my recruitment strategy was $10 to the first 100 people. It was very sweet because some folks were like, no, don't need it. I'm going to be part of research, which was great. And so this is not so great part. I have a 5% full completion rate. So 428 respondents started or basically almost fully completed the survey, while 188 fully completed the survey with all the variables I need. We'll talk about strategies to deal with that later. So my independent variable is trust, which I generated through factor analysis, which I would love to talk about more if anybody would like to. So weird combo of art and science. I split them up. I don't ever test state and federal together. So basically, I asked a series of questions regarding their different trust levels in line with the literature. Where the blank is, put state or federal in that. Talk about factor analysis later if anybody wants. Identity, I did a similar mechanism. I broke them into what I thought would be a personal identity and a social identity. And thankfully, they are really in line with that, which is awesome. So running this all together, I got 2 factors, which I then separated that way. So my dependent variable, which is operationalized as compliance through perceived likelihood of compliance of their peers. I asked them if others abide by all the rules set by federal or state regulators. 0 is never. 1 is sometimes, 2 is almost always, and 3 is always. You know, not the craziest level of variation, but still some variation on that variable, which was exciting to see. My empirical strategy, not too crazy, random LS regression, race, gender, education, age, income, and political ideology controls. For the sake of everybody in the room that doesn't do that, we can talk about it afterwards. But I am not putting graphs in for anybody, so good. So these are my hypotheses. Our findings. So an increase in government trust will be associated with an increase in commitment to regulatory engagement. I find mixed support. I find that that relationship holds in the context of state and it has a positive and significant impact. At the federal level, I don't see a significant impact. For hypothesis 2 and 2A and 2B, where we start to see the idea of the direct impact of identity on trust, social occupational identities, that group identity, see mixed, it was significant, and negative for federal, but there was no significant impact on state. And then as far as individual or personal occupational identity, I didn't have any significant impacts. And then for the idea that there's a mitigating impact of identity on trust in the compliance regulation, no support. So not a mitigating relationship. So my first weird thing is, why do I not see federal trust impacting compliance? Could be that there's possible fallout of trust beyond impact on the federal level. I'm delving more into the literature on trust. Pushing out. There's a right word for that. Crowding out. Thank you. Yep, that's the word. Which thankfully there's a lot of Ostrom fellows that have started to, or have done in-depth delved into that, which is awesome. There's also, we find that federal trust is more susceptible to external factors. Beyond just identity, it's susceptible to age, income, more common than state factors, which could be that there's possible daily interactions with state that isn't occurring at the federal level, so they could just be more insulated to external impacts. We also know that identity plays a role in this relationship, but it's much less straightforward than predicted. So I would love to see more work done on it. So next step, survey number 2. I would love to do it. I'm in the process of finding funding and applying for some grants right now, which is great. I also did a qualitative study and I'm processing interviews. And then I'm hopefully in the process of presenting my findings to the National Marine Fisheries Service, just so we can further have a conversation of why this matters, if this matters. So yeah, that's my work. And a special thank you to the Royston Fellowship and the Indiana University Graduate School for providing funding to me for this. So I got. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. All right, sidestep it.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I'm curious, can you say a little bit more about why you divided out personal identity and social identity?
Indeed, I do not.
Yeah. So the most straightforward response is that's how the literature has divided it so far. And I wanted to stay in line with this idea of occupational identity. The reason that's done in the literature is it has been shown that this idea of group identification and individual identification have had separate impacts. So while you may be highly identified with a group, so I think the best way to think of it is you may be highly identified with being an Ostromite, but you may not personally identify as that very high, that may not be ranked high in your list when you think about your own individual identity versus who you're belonging to in general. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I ask a follow-up? So I'm curious if in the literature, is it that the social identity, especially since you asked about perceptions of peers likelihood to comply, that it's sort of like, if you think your peers are complying and you identify as a part of the group socially, then you'll comply?
Yeah. So But I actually do end up finding in my little models, interesting, so cultural identity wasn't associated with that, which I was surprised that I assumed that I'm not. So this is the impact of identity on compliance. Not reading into it because I think those two are probably really intertwined and I don't. The survey wasn't intended to measure that, so I don't feel comfortable extending that, but I don't see that cultural identity has an impact on it. When I ran the correlation matrix, it wasn't too. I know that's an annoying answer, seemingly not highly correlated.
Looks like James might be next, and then after that.
Yeah, this is really, really interesting to me. And I think it pertains to a lot of different industries, particularly in agriculture, natural resource realm. And so really appreciate learning from you. So just a couple of questions. When is the commercial fishing season in Florida? And like, I'm just curious when that happens.
So it's actually year round most of the time. When I did interviews, almost no fishermen were only engaged in a single fishery. So that was usually just a series of new fisheries every time. Granted, winter is obviously less, or not obviously, winter is less of a popular time.
Gotcha. And the only reason it comes up is that I'm thinking about your survey and you said you ran into some problems with your response rate. But I'm not surprised. It seems like these groups are over surveyed. And I don't know if they get the ag census, but that went out in November. So if they do, then they're getting badgered by the NAS to fill that out. But I know
it was
it.
a week after a hurricane, hence why I need to run another one as well.
So farmers, I basically only surveyed them in like, January, February.
Yeah.
Because the rest of the year they're either farming or it's the holidays. I don't know, just something to think about the timing of that. And that leads me to another question, like, what are your intentions with the second survey? What are you trying to accomplish there? And
Sorry, it's my bad. The first thing I would like to do is because it was run right after a hurricane, I think that probably skewed things pretty aggressively. And so I'd like to see if it did, or at least provide backup for the fact if it did or didn't. Beyond that, I would like more respondents. It wouldn't go out to the same people that already responded, probably. This is also a very new development of the decision that has to be run. I am also currently thinking about if I want to throw on a question about federal response because it was right after the hurricane.
yeah, I mean, I think about the different administrations that are running the federal versus DeSantis. I'm just taking a shot in the dark, might be less, there might be less environmental controls when it comes to DeSantis than there maybe the Biden administration. That would be my.
As far as like the state versus federal?
That'd be my poorly constructed hypothesis.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably fair. The regulatory system that govern fisheries are interestingly less susceptible to political change, seemingly. Because it's a council, so a lot of these positions are elected in or put forward by different groups instead of top down. Magnuson-Stevens, very weird act. So part of that like intentionally collaborative process of that system kind of has some controls to ensure that politics aren't necessarily playing a large role into it. That being said, all of the enforcement is done at the state level. So I would agree with that. I think that DeSantis and the budgetary constraints that are probably being placed on different agencies probably has a pretty big impact versus the interest of the federal government. It's probably definitely a federalism question.
I'll stop with my rambling questions. I'll come up with more.
Just welcome.
Have you looked at all at the economics literature on compliance and regulation as it relates to fisheries?
Yes.
So to what extent might those studies reflect an alternative hypothesis that the level of trust matters less when as the magnitude and likely application of penalties applies.
Yes, so a little background, so when a fisher comes in with a landing, they have to alert the Florida Fish and Wildlife 3 to 4 hours before they land. So someone is there at the dock, counts their fish, make sure it's all on board. The penalties for being found out of compliance are often you lose your boat. It's around $5,000 for like minor penalties, pretty extensive. So the idea of this deterrence effect is like in full effect in fisheries. I think it's interesting to think about the idea of if trust matters more and less in different deterrence level. I think within the United States, I don't know if we see that variation enough to exploit it. But I do hypothetically love to expand this survey to more than the United States. I would love to expand it to Belize because we have similar ecosystems, but very different enforcement structures. So,
Have you thought about other US states too? Like
So-
Maine
yeah, I would love to do that research. It's-
Interesting. Because like to James's point about the DeSantis, like if you got, you know, a place like California or Maine or. Yeah, anyway, you get some other
Yeah.
variables to play with.
Second chapter, and so the third chapter is throughout the United States of my dissertation, so it's looking at between the 90s and early 2000s, gill net bans went in place. So I'm looking at the unintended consequences of that along the coast. But the second chapter is looking into the threat and tension. So in the northeastern fisheries, we don't see that as much. They're referred to more almost as like mafia fisheries, because like they're very, very, very insulated, super fascinating, really different than the Florida fisheries. So I do think those would be a really fascinating compare as far as the impact of trust. Specifically, I think in that context, I think engagement and involvement with the regulation process is probably the biggest indicator there.
Yeah, it's an interesting talk, and I think you saw a version of this earlier, so you're moving forward on this. Which is good, because when you get the damn thing done. When I was reading this, I kept having a little bit of problem, or getting my mind around your hypotheses. Because I kept thinking of trust as sort of a two-way relationship. In your hypotheses in your presentation was all about the trust of the fishers. I guess their trust in other fisher people and but also especially their trust in the regulators. And I think eventually, probably not in the dissertation, it would be nice to see the trust side on the administrator side, the regulator side. To what extent are they trusting? I think that's going to relate to how stringent they might, the regulations might be in different types of fisheries, if that's at all a variation in what you're looking at. But I think it might help in some of this, especially when you're getting to the point of publishing this as an article or something down the road. Because your dissertation committee is going to kind of know what you're doing, but your hypotheses were stated in such a way that it sounded like, you know, trust had this effect. And when I read that, I always said trust of the individual fishermen in the regulators. And so, I mean, there could be lots of different trusts that are involved in that.
Right.
And I think that having that caveat in there might really help, because some people are, especially when you get to the point of having reviewers in this, and you might as well sort of get in the habit of being a little more precise that way as you bring this, so you can make the translation into that, because I think others are going to think in terms of this. And I think also it was interesting that the quote you started from Lynn was kind of an interesting one for her, because it was almost a question directed at someone outside the community rather than the communities themselves. It's like a question of to rebuild a sense of trust is kind of something that a policymaker would come into this, or a reformer or something, come an advocate. And that's kind of, I think, your public management trained, so that's kind of where you're coming from too. And Lynn was usually more sort of talking about what was happening internally, and most of the time when she's talking about trust, that's the kind of trust that she's talking about, but you're really dealing with this other kind of trust. And I'm pretty sure I mentioned this before during the mini conference, but if not, I'll hit you with it again. If you get to that point of looking at that relationship, that's where I think the policy feedback literature would be really useful for you to look at, because the way in which administrators or implementing street level bureaucrats or whatever interact with the individual recipients, whether it's a beneficiary of a program or someone being regulated, can have a major impact on trust and sense of autonomy and sense of worthiness of self and individuals. And there's a lot of stuff in that, and a lot of source of resource. And I think that's probably going to be related to the state and federal relationship that you're getting here differently. Say they have more personal interaction with the state regulators. And trust is something that gets built up more sort of with personal reactions than abstract kinds of things, or there's two different kinds of trust. Personal trust and the general kind of trust.
I just think it's enforcement trust versus regulatory trust is maybe the better way to.
Because that's what they're interacting with. They're not really interacting with the regulatory process, but how they're sort of, so that's sort of where, or do you think that the penalties are fair? I don't know if you have questions like that in your survey. To develop that a little bit, but I guess just sort of to be careful, the word trust can mean a lot of different things.
That's a very good, I think the policy feedback literature is a great comment. I hadn't even thought about that.
Okay.
Do these Fisher groups not interact at the regulatory level?
So I have a question on interaction as well. I don't have statistics up for today. They do, it is a couple times a year, they'll have meetings. They'll have regional meetings, so
Would this
they.
be with NOAA fisheries or?
This would be with, so NOAA fisheries, the marine fisheries is federal, and then there's regional, so they would interact at the regional level.
But they don't interact at all at the point of regulation making?
Regulations are
Federal.
made at the regional level,
Oh, okay.
so technically they are, but
Gonna go.
exceptions of involvement are very skewed.
So I have a couple of questions. It's kind of related to what open, like when I think of trust, do you mean a trust of a certain person like John or Mary, or the trust of John and Mary as Black people or as Asian American? So this is kind of like a group trust or community trust. And if it's like group trust, then they belong to two groups. I mean, they can be an American, and the Asian American has a certain level of trust, but they are also fishers, and fishers have a level of a trust generally that is influenced, I guess, by their experience as a fisher. So you have at least two, if not more, group identity that affect trust. How it is affected from their occupation, how it is affected by their identity. So this is a question of what are you going for? And the other question is, when you're talking about in the regulation, how much they trust the regulation, I was kind of thinking there is, or how much the regulation was good, the regulation from the government. There might be a difference between restrictive regulations, so all the rules that tells them don't do that, and then maybe they tend to more dislike it because it's restrictive. Or if you have a supportive regulation or government action, so if there is a whole package that on the one hand tells you don't do that, but there is also some support for fisheries in providing all sorts of services and whatnot. So then if it comes as a package, they might have a bit more trust.
To clarify, your first question was about intersectionality of identity. It's definitely a weakness in this project that I don't necessarily have enough data to really exploit upon that. Most of my participants are older white men that have lower education. So that variation in actual identity isn't necessarily there. But I agree with you that I would love to eventually kind of explore some more ingrained experiential identities that impact trust as well. So that's great feedback. And then the regulation point is a great point. I would love to think more about that.
On that
sure.
point, you're also going to be thinking about the job market talks before too long. And so if this were a job market talk, I would suggest a better answer. So that's sort of framing it a little different. I think you already do some of that. And when you're looking at your individual identity versus the occupational identity. Not exactly sure what you're doing there, but those are like two different kinds of identity. And so it's
Sure.
defining two different kinds of trust. So you're getting to part of what he was questioning about.
Yeah.
So you need to sort of say, well, I've done some of this
Yeah.
in this sort of way and stuff like that. So just back your mind.
But do you have I saw you.
I do for it. But yeah, so kind of thinking about presentation, not about like the actual results or whatever. Knowing that you've got what you got for the job market. I think in the framing, there's kind of a component missing, which is like the stakes of trust here.
Mm.
So like us trained in the Austrian tradition, we kind of know that trust matters.
Yeah.
But if I'm not trained, I don't really get why this matters, right? Like I might think like, oh, who cares if they trust, right? They have to comply or
Yeah.
there's enforcement or whatever. And so if you just have some way to better outline what happens when we lose trust, especially if there's salient examples from like other fisheries about what happens when trust breaks down, that would really help push the point of why all of this matters.
So great. Thank you.
So I would, if you don't mind, could you elaborate on your survey data collection methods? I know you speak to it in the paper briefly, but I'm curious like how your process and how you went about that.
I utilized IU Qualtrics, and it was so from the record on commercial fishing, they all have to have an email record, and so I emailed everyone that is a commercial fisher.
Okay.
And then I sent 3 or 4 follow-up emails over the period of a month around every week
Okay,
to remind them.
awesome. So I'm curious because like in my world, there would be a lot of discussion of your methods in a paper.
Yeah.
And so like getting into that and like sort of if you followed like Salon or Dillman or whoever you followed, their sort of protocol and stuff.
Sure.
I mean, that, because you're gonna have to defend your 5% response rate. Like, or like a general population survey, the response rate's like 10 or 11%. And so you're thinking about how you're gonna defend that low response rate and like, what are the circumstances that may have led to that? Like you spoke about the hurricane or and maybe it's like key fishing season or
Yeah.
something like that. I would just be ready. And you said you were gonna think about ways to combat that, you know, or to sort of argue why this might still be a viable response. And I don't know if you're gonna do some analysis like, or make some comparisons with other surveys, like these people were demographically not that dissimilar from others that got a 25% response rate.
Yeah. There so far has not been any census or even really in-depth survey of commercial fishermen in Florida.
That's
The
surprising,
most
huh?
recent one was in the 90s.
Wow.
People are retired.
Well, you'd think, but I tell you, those folks, they're old.
What do you say?
Offense, right?
60% of my survey was over 55 doing a manual labor.
old, okay?
Manual labor job,
Away.
that's intensive.
And one thing on this, I will say on this one, I would change, like, I don't think you could, like, some of your demographic variables, I don't think they lend themselves to means and so forth. Like,
Yes.
I would think, yeah, when you get to the, clean that up, get rid of the means for white, male, bachelor's degree, because those are all categorical data.
Also,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I know this is, I mean, I realize this is work in progress.
No, you are right. This has been an ongoing, how to to display the demographics has been an ongoing discussion of best practices.
Yeah.
So far, I haven't really found one I like yet,
I
so.
sent your reference on the email survey design, and it sounds like you followed a similar approach to what they did. But I would just like beef that end up.
Yeah.
So.
No, thank you. That's great advice.
Well, thanks again. This is really interesting. I want to use it. I like these, I guess, perspective or how this relates to the dairy industry, because I know a lot of dairy farmers that have stopped selling milk, but they still milk cows for
Yeah.
whatever reason. And they just dump it.
Yeah.
Really, they still milk cows because that's what they've done.
Cows need to be milked.
Well, the cows need to be milked, but they don't sell the cows. They,
Fish need
they-
to be alive.
it's just, it's the culture of their being.
Yeah, no, there's, I think, I would like to eventually, hypothetically, in a dream world, I would love to expand this. There's a lot of different cultures that have a really, really ingrained understanding of fishing. Specifically, like if we look in the Baltic, it's a lot more like the Northeast coast where there's this really ingrained sense of like, if you only get in it if your family did it.
You don't get out.
And you don't get out. Yeah, it's like what you do. And we see that, even talking about the talk on Monday as well. There's this interesting connection between environment and economic prospects in a lot of different areas. So I think understanding kind of how those interplay as we start to kind of, understand that there's mandated, like we need regulations regarding a lot of these things. That's just kind of the reality of modern governance. Whether that's right or not. So I think kind of understanding like, well, how does that impact people? Which is really important. So this is.
Gustavo?
Okay, so I was thinking about compliance in general and more specific about your project. So it's like, if you think about complying with any regulation, you might think like, well, it's you have benefits from not complying, okay? Then on the other side of the equation, you have costs. What are those costs of not complying? First, formal cost. Essentially, well, the regulator comes and give you a fine. So there's some probability that they will catch you or not. So essentially, it's a probability of being caught times penalties when you are caught. So the traditional econ crime model, if you want. And then you have like an informal cost, okay? So what's that informal cost? So that's essentially like what punishment the peers will implement if they discover that you did not comply.
Yeah.
Okay? So in that sense, it's like, so if you start thinking in that way, so that gives you kind of a structure to think about the problem. So it's like, and then on the benefit side, you may have different people and in different circumstances, the benefit for non-complying could be different, no? So,
Yeah.
And then on the cost part, it's pretty clear because you need to go and check what's the formal rule, no? And then you know what it is, okay? So then what I would like to see more is a little bit more digging on what are those informal mechanisms exactly. So because then you can start talking more about, are we talking about informal mechanisms substituting or complementing those formal mechanisms, how they really operate? It's more like, it's when there is low level of formal compliance, they come up with supporting monitoring and punishment, or it's the other way around. It's essentially because there is already the federal government implementing a reasonable rule, they just say, okay, it's like we don't need the informal mechanism. So it's like more about that, okay?
Yeah.
And then, so if you know more about that, then I think it's going to be clear how to instrument trust.
Yeah.
So essentially, because for me right now, trust is a little bit. I don't know where I should put it, no.
Yeah.
But if you map that thing there, okay. Now trust essentially it operates in which sense? It allows you the informal mechanisms to work better, to complement better with the formal mechanism, and so on. So I don't know. I'm just
Yeah. This is one of those.
random thoughts, no, it's just like, but just with that structure. And it will also help somebody that is not coming with the Ostrom perspective, as he was mentioning, to, see the connections, no? Because look, at the end, even if you're talking about informal mechanisms, they need to monitor, they need to know that you are not complying, and they need to find informal mechanisms to punish you when you are not doing it, because otherwise they don't change things, okay? So, or you need to create some social rule that people internalize, and then you produce some kind of, again, internal punishment when you do not comply, okay? And by the way, if the formal rule is perceived as very unfair or very inconvenient, there could be social rewards for not complying. So especially even at that level, no? So it's like you are a good part of this team when you are, doing some extra harvesting without the regulators knowing, no?
Yeah.
So again, with that give you kind of a nice structure to think about.
This is one of those very fun moments where qualitative research provides the best answer for your question, and I've done it. So I've a lot of the informal mechanisms are really interesting within fishery systems. 1994, there was a net ban, really broke apart a lot of those social structures that commercial fishing had. The infrastructure got devastated. A lot of these communities kind of got ripped apart because it became more competitive. When I asked them about informal mechanism structures, they had two responses. The first one was like, I wouldn't tell on anybody. Like, that's not my business. Would never do that. Wouldn't want them to do it either though, but wouldn't trust them if they did it. Would never tell on them if they did though. The second was like, well, if someone gets in the bad graces of our group, we'll just tattle on them. So it's almost the informal societal structures aren't necessarily even there anymore, which I think if I, shoulda, coulda, woulda done this in the 90s, I think they may have been a little bit more ingrained because they had more financial power. I think now it's just a lot of tattletaling is the only informal, which is still kind of formal way to go about it. I definitely, I'm in the process of going through all those interviews right now. So I think that's a great response, both your response and their response. I think it's a great one.
Now that we've gotten to the qualitative data. I'd love to I'd love to hear more about the sociality between the shores. So what are the times and spaces that they interact? If, I understand that people on a boat together would have a lot of time together, but what about people connecting between boats and also moving across the coast? What are those spaces of sociality?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different associations. So one of the main ones in Florida is the Gulf Fishermen's, well, it's not in Florida, it's in the Gulf. The Gulf Fishermen's Association. The times of interaction are often at regional local meetings or seeing each other out on the dock or the bar. The interaction between captain and crew is actually a very weird one that I haven't really gotten into. A lot of the comments I got, because of the way my data set was registered, I predominantly, specifically in qualitative, almost exclusively talk to captains. They're the owners of the license versus it's a whole other thing. The perceptions of crew is druggies that are looking for quick money. Perceptions of other captains is hardworking people doing their best. They see each other out on the water. They see each other when they dock. The main interactions. As far as the cross-coastal, since the 1994 net ban, people don't really travel because now for high monetary fishing, you go deep sea. So it's more out and in versus up and down. So it's pretty regional packed. That being said, they do know each other. There's only 500 deep sea fishermen in Florida, so.
Can you go on this point?
Yeah, sure.
So that's a clear example that friends don't let friends eat. That's essentially a typical example of a informal mechanisms to sustain through informal punishment.
Yeah.
A market restriction.
The interesting.
So essentially, that's if you talk with people talking about peer monitoring, all it's like the perfect example. But it's a different thing. It's not all complaining on how much you are harvesting.
Yeah.
It's about on restricting others to enter into the market. Imports.
Yeah,
It's a complete different thing.
Yeah, so
sorry.
I'm sure you find similar things by the steel industry. Every importing.
Yeah,
Every industry which you have a lot of imports will have a version of this among their members.
but the interesting, I mean, I think that's a great point. I've been framing that as threat. But I think the idea of restrictions to entry is such a cool point. Because they also hate recreational fishers. So.
and that brings up my question. So I wonder if you might get a better sense of trust relations if you drill down a little more specifically about what they trust the state or the federal government or neither to do. So, for example, how well do you trust the state to keep foreign fishers out of the exclusive economic zone? Do you trust the federal government to do that? Do you trust the state to regulate properly recreational fishers? Do you trust the federal government?
Yeah,
to do that?
yeah, and
Yeah, so trust relationships are often very nuanced, right? In all areas, so it might differ from issue to issue.
that's a good point. For some reason, often with like psychology research and stuff, you try to get really coy with asking what you want to actually ask.
Right.
I think if I could full redo it again, I would have my same set of like getting at the question, but I would also just blatantly ask like, oh, how much do you trust?
Yeah, because I would imagine, especially back in the day, it's probably long lost sight of now, when the US first really started enforcing its exclusive economic zone against foreign fishers. The fishers loved that government.
I bet they would.
Yeah.
I actually have one question. So this is kind of motivated by the regulation compliance stuff that you're talking about. I was curious, based on your research, what regulations do you think are least complied with?
Yeah.
Like what regulations that like people in the fishing industry hate or think are stupid, or how closely tied are those to some of the sustainability goals that you were talking about? Yes, like what's not being complied with, and I think that kind of connects to the importance of trust and project generally.
Yeah, that's a great question. The regulations that are found to be most frustrated with aren't the regulations that I would say seem to financially impact them the most. They are comfortable being regulated with their fish. They're comfortably regulated how much they can take. They're comfortable being regulated when they can take it. I'm sure they would prefer a little bit more flexibility, as we'd all like to make more money. But they're generally okay with that. It's the smaller ones that they view as punitive. So first of all, the net ban they really, really hated. That's a whole other thing. But as far as daily regulations, they have to have a tire on board in case a turtle is caught. They have to have a specific brand of it's like this weird pool that it looks almost the back of a canoe paddle. A specific brand has to be bought of that. And so it's like little things like that, like the 4 hours before getting docked, they really get frustrated with. So it's mainly the restrictions on their freedoms and their choices that really seem to frustrate them the most. The idea of like the major regulations, which would be like actual fish related ones, they're pretty comfortable with. Other than they also really hate the fact that if they bring a fish up and it's not sized, they have to throw it back for them, that they view that as waste. But that's gonna be dead anyway. That'd be the only thing that I would say as far as fish go, that they all think is very dumb.
Comment when you talk about trust in the government, so for example, trust in the federal government might differ depending who is sitting in the White House. But if you did your previous survey and your next one within the same administration, that shouldn't be a fact. So maybe just a comment to it that it was done during the same administration.
It would be during the same administration. I hope to kind of get at political differences with, because Florida's had a rather conservative governor in place. Didn't necessarily get at that, but hypothetically, I would love to expand it.
Just saying that it might complicate if your next survey would be when there is a different party in the White House, it might affect the trust in the federal government.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much to worry about this because it's, but I could see you getting asked about it in a job talk. The general relationship again between trust and compliance and rule compliance can be very attenuated, right? So I'm thinking, you know, in a police state, I imagine most people do not trust the government. And yet compliance is going to be very high, rules regardless. And so how might you respond to a question that's approached that way about, you know, I mean, it sort of goes back to the question from the mini conference, what are you actually measuring?
Yeah. So I almost view that question in two aspects, kind of going off your question of why does trust matter? In the context, well, from an ideological perspective, the idea that the rules and regulations that are made to enforce laws in the United States are supposed to be equitable. We don't acknowledge that, you know, this intersectional identity impacts how people view and are impacted by compliance. I think that's a failure of democracy. That aside, United States fishery system is extensive and big. Hard to catch someone if they want to actually do something wrong. They don't call in, you don't have that trust established, and they don't call in 4 hours between, the chances of you actually catching them pretty slim. Even I asked them their perceived
Penalties are so high.
why the penalties are high, but their perceived level of detection, no, if I wanted to, no one could catch me.
So, ultimately, is the trust then more in the process or in the substance?
I think it's both. I think there's, I think respect is maybe respect and.
There's a lot of in criminology and other literatures about really being more about a process that's perceived as fair and reasonably neutral and that.
So in the Magnuson-Stevens Act, the idea of trust and collaborative governance is actually written into it. It's the way it's set up. If it's not functioning that way, it's a policy failure.
Yeah.
Beyond that, I think it's both. I think it's both the process and regulations. I think you have to have trust in the regulations to actually be improving upon your resource and your perceived economic benefits of it. And then I think you actually have to trust the process that those that are engaging in it are engaging in it appropriately, equitably, and out to get you. Be the best way to put it.
Almost at time. Final thoughts or
Thank you so much. If anybody has any idea where I could get a probably $1,000 to $2,000 of funding, please throw it my way. I will say some interesting questions about federal response to hurricanes. If you want to throw a question on there, I'm more than willing. Genuinely, thank you all for coming and thank you for listening to that. I really appreciate it.
Line.